Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, a leadership and organizational development consultancy. And today you are joining us for the last online and of all events this year as part of the Cosmic Conference, our 2-month-long conference. The first event, I think, was on September 27th, and now we're November 19th. So almost a 2-month-long conference all about leadership polarities, titled The Cosmic Dance, Mastering Dualities in Leadership. We've been running the Cosmic Conference for 5 years now, and one of our principles is sharing what we learn with the world, which is why we make all of this conference and all of its content freely available for everybody, and today is no exception. Every year we choose a theme that we think is going to resonate with the leaders we work with, and this year we chose what we believe to be a timeless theme to help leaders master a key skill for navigating a complex world, the topic of polarities. Simply put, all leaders, whether they've been in the C-suite for decades or are first-time managers, are always navigating seemingly opposing tensions. Being in the present, envisioning the future, engaging your people, demanding performance, building a company that is profitable, investing in growth, and the list goes on. Great leaders know that their superpower comes from having range, and the ability to dance along the spectrum is what drives sustainable organizational growth. They go from either-or mentality to a both-and mentality that allows them to thrive in a complex world. Now, joining me today is Joe Santos. Joe has joined every single closing of every single Cosmic Conference, and the year where he tells us he's no longer interested in doing this, we may cancel the conference altogether. Joe is a personal mentor of mine and an affiliated professor of practice in global management. After spending 20 years in the managerial world, he moved from Italy to INSEAD and devoted himself to scholarly work, a dream from his youth. His research and teaching focuses on the management of multinational enterprises, and particularly on the management of global integration and global innovation. Joe, thank you so much for joining us again this year.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now, because you and I, Joe, we like to be a little bit controversial, in this session, we're actually going to challenge conventional thinking on polarities. We're going to explore how management in complexity and emergence demands integration over simple trade-offs. And we're going to do this because we believe that every framework, including the polarities, thinking, mapping, whatever we want to call it, has limitations. After all, the map is never the territory. And Joe and I have spent some time, many sessions, preparing for this and reflecting on the contexts within which thinking in polarities may fail us. And we've identified 3 situations where blindly approaching things as a polarity may be misleading. So we're going to talk in 3 chapters. First, when we experience a lack of conceptual rigor. Second, when we exist in a context that demands a radical approach. And third, when we confuse the whole and the parts. Before we start, if anyone in the audience has any questions or comments, please drop them in the comment box. And if Joe and I don't end up talking for an hour and a half, we may get to some of them. But let's begin. I'm going to introduce our first chapter, which is lack of conceptual rigor. In our research around this topic and in the last couple of months, we've been clear to identify that polarities refer to interdependent pairs. That's how they were defined by some of the earlier thinkers on this topic. We understand these pairs to both be valuable and necessary for a system to thrive. You, Joe, call them mutually constitutive. We'll get to that in a second. And these tensions, like short-term, long-term, individual, collective, whatever they may be called, the idea is that we must take advantage of the positive sides of both in order to truly derive value. Now, it becomes very easy to then view any opposing tension as a polarity, but are things always a polarity? So let's start, as always. I think we always start every session we've ever had with a bit of, not necessarily a definition, but making sure that we explore the meaning of things and that we have rigor in terms of the words that we use. So what is your perspective, Joe, on what is a polarity? How do we define it? How do we know that we are in a polarity?
Well, polarity or poles are extremes. And so in a way, polarity is a relationship between 2 opposing things. And these opposing things, though opposing, often call for a balance or determine a balance. And therefore, when this balance exists, there comes the whole thesis of the conference, which was the end. So it's not one pole, quote unquote, against the other. It is one pole and the other, because that determines the field. So if we use physics, and for example, a magnetic field, we have a North Pole and a South Pole. And exactly, the North Pole and the South Pole are mutually constitutive, meaning there isn't one without the other. And one determines the other. One cannot exist without the other. And indeed, there's no field if the two are not linked by the field. The field actually links these extremes. So the extremes are not separated as they may seem. And that's, I think, this case, the polarity, this sort of relationship between polarity and poles, even the North and South Pole, as we call them, when referring to the magnetism of the Earth or to magnetism in general in physics, is very useful. There's a slight difference between polarity and duality, which is the construct in the title of the conference, but which is also often used. Indeed, when I started many years ago, I'm not going to even want to recall that, but the word polarity was not used that I can recall in management conversations or business studies. The word duality was already used. Duality and polarity are not exactly the same thing conceptually, because duality is again a relationship, but it's more a relationship about the dual nature of something. So, for example, we know that light or photons in physics are deemed to be a wave and a particle, and they have a dual nature. And again, the dual nature in this particular case means that one can be transformed into the other. For example, by observing or by interacting with the material world, lights behave like a pattern, a particle. And when irradiating, when transmitting over a vacuum, for example, it behaves like a wave. So one can transform into the other. The two are there, but often one is more visible or present than the other. But there has been, in a way, in practice, a certain parallel between using the word duality and the word polarity in many different fields. And we can think of, for example, economics, where these words are often used when you think about supply and demand. In psychology, when you think, for example, of love and hate, which again are often together. People that love each other sometimes hate each other. So the and is there, not all the time at the same time, but the nature of these emotions make them, in a way, dual emotions. It's present in physics, in nature, in many respects, and of course in business and management. And you gave already a few examples that are very important. This idea of short-term and long-term, we'll come to that later on. The polarity of explore versus exploit, which you just covered in your closing session a moment ago. So there's a number of them that are relevant. The idea of control versus flexibility, the idea of centralization versus decentralization. These are all polarities that exist in the world of business and management, and that were covered during the conference in many respects. So why is this relevant for us now, this notion of conceptual rigor? And before we go deeper into it, when it comes to polarities, I think I would like to make a more general statement, which is, in management, and in particular in corporate management, business management is a little bit less prone to the challenge that I'm going to refer to, corporate management is indeed fully abstract. When you manage a corporation, you're not managing anything concrete. And when we manage in abstract, like, for example, managing a multinational company, you can't, a multinational company is not a concrete thing. You can't see the multinational company. You can't touch it. You can't feel it. You can only feel or see instances of it that are all local. And we'll come back to that. But there are some, well, I did that and I have studied that for quite some time. There are those that manage the corporate entity, the multinational company or the multi-business company or the multi-business multinational company. And they need to be extremely capable to manage in an abstract world. And the only thing we have in abstraction are, for example, concepts. And if they're not rigorous, then it is actually impossible to manage. And indeed, many fail at corporate management because of that need for rigor that is often forgotten with the use of metaphorical language, with the use of analogies that are not deemed analogies, but they seem to replace indeed whatever we want to say. And just to finish here, paradoxes, for example, are statements, right? Polarities are relations. Paradoxes are statements. Dilemmas and trade-offs are situations. They're all actually related, all these things that I referred to, but they are all very different in nature. And that rigor, I think, is important for us to use them in managing, be it managing a team or a whole company or just a part of a company.
I mean, you had not said this to me in any of our preparation sessions, but the simple separation between polarities being relational, dilemmas being situational, for example, is already one key lesson that I would frame. And we're only 10 minutes in. That's lovely. Thank you for that. You and I spoke about when rigor goes wrong when it comes to polarities. And you gave me a great example that used to be seen as a polarity, a few decades ago when you, we shall not name the decade, but when you were doing, when you were leading a global company, and that is the polarity, which maybe turned out not to be one, of quality and cost. Tell me about that.
Yes. First of all, even before that, when I studied at London Business School, like many others, we were confronted with this notion that quality and cost were somehow opposed. That if you wanted to achieve high quality, there was high cost involved, and you couldn't have one without the other. In that sense, if you wanted low cost, you had to have low quality. But then there were all the studies that were made, namely in the early 80s and after that, on what became known as Japanese total quality management, or the Toyota production system, as it is also sometimes referred to. And then I think many discovered that you could have quality at a very low cost or at a very efficient cost. And so I think that empirically, we can somehow find out in time or in a different context that may come up in space or time, that beliefs about certain poles are at least partly false, and that there may be conditions under which they're not poles, they're simply features, orthogonal features. So for me, for example, quality and cost are just orthogonal features of an operation or of a product. And the fact that they are orthogonal means that we can make choice on both, and that they're not opposing, They're just two different features. Now, again, some of the confusion that existed in the past may still exist today, relates with the lack of rigor in defining what quality is. It's relatively easy to mean what cost is. When people say cost, more or less we know what they're talking about. But when you say quality, what do you mean quality? Quality from the point of view of the demand side of the market, quality from the point of view of the regulator side of the market, of the supply side of the market. What quality? And there lies, you see, that's where things begin to be a little bit confusing. And therefore, polarities may seem to exist, while conceptual rigor and empirical evidence over time may teach us that they are not there.
Yeah.
Or at least they're not there in certain circumstances. And it's important to know which circumstances.
And another, element of conceptual rigor. So we talked about, is it a polarity or not? And you just explained and gave us a great example of how something that may have appeared to be one is discovered actually to have been, as you said, orthogonal, two different features, two different axes that we were looking at that were not in relation to one another. But another rigor, element of rigor that one needs to bring in is to name the correct polarity. And I think you and I talked about a great example of, is it called centralization, decentralization, or concentration, dispersion? I wonder if you could share that example.
Yes. So you see, in practice, and I found this in many companies, excellent companies, so this has no relationship with the quality of the company or its management. I have found that for many, centralization, decentralization is also used to mean concentration and dispersion. Because you see, center, it's a bit of a confusing expression, because when we say centralization and decentralization, for example, referring to what it is, which is the distribution of decision rights or power, we think of the center as the top. So centralization means that, well, full centralization means that all decisions are made at the top of the organization. But often, at least until recently, most companies had the top in one place, which, by the way, was called a headquarters, the place where the head is, speaking about metaphors. And therefore, sometimes people say centralization, meaning we are all here at the center, as opposed to we could be dispersed around the world. And there's some relationship between centralization and concentration and decentralization and dispersion. And this relationship doesn't exist. You could have a dispersed organization, highly centralized, or you could have a concentrated organization, highly decentralized. So again, it's important to be conceptually rigorous. Otherwise, you may be speaking of a polarity, and the other one speaking with you may have another polarity in their mind. And that's also confusing, very confusing, actually. So that's one of the limitations of polarity, because of this ambiguity sometimes, this equivocality, because of the way we use concepts. Now, there's even sometimes, I've also found an even worse confusion, which is confusion between delegation and decentralization. And it's very important also to clear this, otherwise it's kind of a mess. I may have the decision right of A, and then I can somehow let you, Berlin, for a period of time, or for certain cases, make the decision of A. But it's still my decision, right? So it's mine, not yours. So, but I can kind of afford you that right in particular circumstances. without letting go of it. So I can
Mm.
always pull it back. That's delegation. Delegation is a form of centralization with certain qualities to it. Decentralization is different. Decentralization means that I do not make certain decisions. I may make decision A, but not decision B. And you, Marilyn, which by the way happened to be at a quote unquote lower level in the organization, could also be far away from me or close to me, you make decision B. And so the question is, but why would you make decision B if I make decision A? Why can't I make both? And why can't you make both? And the idea there, for example, is very well encapsulated in what we call the principle of subsidiarity, which was articulated in the late 19th century, that says decisions should be made at the lowest level of the organization where they can effectively be made, and not a level above. And if you follow that principle, by the way, which, by the way, applies decision by decision, then actually decentralization and centralization are not polarities. Because they're only, in a way, they're polarities for each choice. And by the way, for each choice, it can't be both. And in that sense, it is not a polarity. You can't be, for one decision, centralizing it and decentralizing it at the same time.
That's very
So
true.
if you think one decision at a time, then there is no polarity. There's a choice between, I make the choice or you make the choice. I make the decision or you make the decision. And again, if you follow the principle of subsidiarity, then the lowest level in the organization,
Bless you. I was just going to say, I think you gave me my word of the year for 2025. Subsidiarity. I've been reflecting, I think all at a stage of a company like ours, especially all leaders kind of struggle with wanting to empower the people around them, but of course still needing to be in control of a lot of things. And I think you've just given me my intention word for next year. I love it. I think that's really, when you said it, I was like, wow, you couldn't hear me because I was on mute. I was like, oh, wait, did he name this for me before? I couldn't remember. So that's it. Then this is where, honestly, like, I also wanted to bring this point, the conceptual rigor piece. Like, this is why I'm personally so lucky to have people like you in my life, because I understand that it's easy to conceptualize something and then lose sense of what it means. As you said, in the very beginning of our discussion, is that the more we manage at a corporate level, the more we have to manage through these concepts and through abstractions. And if we don't understand how to be rigorous around them, then we'll simply mismanage things. We're lucky if we do it well,
Yes.
Joe,
And
before
by
we
the
move on.
way, so according to this principle of subsidiarity, as I said, formulated at the end of the 19th century, the idea is simple. If you have a level at the organization that has all the relevant knowledge to make the choice, that level should make the choice.
Yeah.
It is only when pieces of knowledge that are required for the choice only exist at other levels, usually above, then the choice could go above. But so you start from below, you start from everything being decentralized, and then you choose what to centralize according to the knowledge or some specific resources that are required for the choice, for the decision to be made. And then you kind of bring the decision upwards. I think that's an excellent principle. For example, if you think of what we tend to describe as an ideal marketplace, that's right, where consumers and suppliers meet to transact, in that place, there is no power of ones over the others, right? So each one is free. So it has the free will to choose what to buy or not to buy, what to sell and not to sell. Unfortunately, real markets are not like that. They're a bit more complicated. And that's actually when the polarity may show up. Meaning you may have situations where, in principle or formally, the choice is decentralized, but in reality, it is centralized. And that's the situation where there is a real polarity. And we now have a situation where in some markets, central government wants to regulate a lot of business, a lot of markets. And in other countries, for example, where this idea is not as popular, the reality is that in many, many business sectors, concentration over the last 20 or 30 years means that a few companies at the top from the supply side control the market or have market power, which means when the customer that is supposed to be free to make their own decisions goes to buy from some company, it has no alternative.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't buy there, it'll buy there. And there's some sort of either tacit collusion or other forms of arrangements that basically means that there is power from the supply side, which is one of the reasons for many economists that study these things. I don't, but for those that study these things, this is one of the reasons why exploration has gone down dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years. And of course, with it, innovation has gone down, contrary to popular belief.
We need a whole other session to explore this
Yes,
one.
it's a different discussion. But my point is, you see, in this case, because there is a polarity in a way, hidden polarity, which is not the common one we discuss when we think of centralization, decentralization. Here, I'm putting together this decision rights question with the supply and demand side of the market.
Very clear.
When this becomes blurred and the supply side has tremendous power over the demand side, it may be then that, of course, although we may think that we have the choice to buy or the choice to decide when and what to buy, we actually don't.
Yeah.
Because we are controlled by the suppliers.
Makes sense to me. And I think you mentioned something that is going to segue us beautifully into our second chapter, which is that there are situations, there are contexts where this whole discussion becomes irrelevant. You know, to be cliche, desperate times may call for desperate measures. And certain situations, extreme contexts, may call for being more radical, not balancing things. So first, let's talk simply about maybe describe some of the contexts that clear polarities that require a radical approach rather than a balanced one.
Yes, absolutely. So the polarity is still there. So you still have these two opposing concepts or notions, but you don't need to worry anymore about the choice because the choice is made for you in a way. So the polarity is cleared by the context. And the first context in which this, I think, became obvious to all of us was our last critical crisis. We don't have many critical crises. Indeed, at the world scale, we only had one about 100 years ago, and then one about a few years ago, the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, which is truly worldwide, in the sense of affecting everybody, everywhere. And it is critical because it went to the roots of our own existence. So what was at stake was our individual existence and our existence as a species. One could, in some sort of pandemic, see our species disappear or other critical crises. So when a crisis like that happens, we go into a situation of absolute uncertainty. Not risk, but absolute uncertainty, meaning we have no clue about the future. And the future could be next day or next week. And we are completely ignorant of what may happen. Actually, we cannot list alternative states of nature in the future, as we often say, again, trying to be as rigorous with our language as possible. We can't basically, if you think of scenario planning, which is not very popular and everybody understands these notions, if you think of scenario planning, you develop certain scenarios, which are possible states of the future. And then you often link that each scenario with a probability. And then you can even do beautiful calculations like the expected return of a particular choice. Now, when under absolute uncertainty or radical uncertainty, you cannot list the scenarios. You don't know. Perhaps you know one or two, but there may be four. Or you can list 400. And you can list 400 is actually the same as listing none, because it's impossible to work from 400 scenarios tomorrow to a choice today. So in that case, so when there is this situation of absolute uncertainty, that clears certain polarities for us. For example, during the pandemic, many of us, if not all, were confronted with something we are confronted every day, which is this sort of polarity between individual freedom and safety or security. And we take care. We don't do certain things we could otherwise do because they may either mean potential harm to us, harm that can be extremely harmful, dangerous, even to the point of taking our lives away, or harmful for those we love or those around us. And we often are confronted with this, and some people may actually be both. They may be, free and do what they want to do and still run some risks. For example, people that enjoy radical sports, which, by the way, are called radical for that very reason. Now, during the pandemic, many, we had this clear to them, either because there was regulations, there were certain rules put in place, very strong rules, or because your own choice of protecting yourself and those around you, those that live with you, often your loved ones, your family, made us go for safety instead of freedom. And we kind of let go of freedom because we preferred, in a way, the radical situation that we were in to hear the polarity for us. And we didn't really have a choice to make. I'm not saying that all accepted that well. That's a different discussion. Many actually didn't like that choice. And many behaved as if it was not their problem. Well, many of them died or their families died, or others died that interacted with them. But for most of us, that decision was, that polarity was cleared by it. So a critical context like that, which could be a revolution, could be a great war, these extreme, radical, or critical situations make clear polarities for us.
Yes.
Then there is another situation that can clear polarities for us. For example, in this case, say for us as investors, or for us as working for funds that invest, or for us that work in companies or manage companies, is that if the fund, for example, that you're working for, or the investment company that you're working for, has, say, a contrarian strategy, then what for others may be a choice between two extremes, because you are following a strategy, in this case, a contrarian strategy, If the market goes one way, you go the other way. You don't have to do and, just go the other way. And again, that's a situation where a strategy, so in this case, a choice made by someone or some organization or some leadership team of the organization, clears polarities for everybody else. Another case could be simply the company has a business strategy or a competitive strategy. And that competitive strategy is such that it clears polarities, like, for example, short-term, long-term, or exploration versus exploitation, or innovation versus efficiency. Depends on the strategy of the company. So for companies that have chosen a path of, quote unquote, changing the world, or more rigorously shaping their markets, as opposed to adapting to the markets. So companies have changed industries and markets, like, for example, IKEA or IKEA, or Ford, or Apple, or Tesla, just to name a few, or Nokia. These companies that have this aim, explicit or implicit, doesn't matter, but it's clear in their strategy and it's clear for the people in the companies. For them, the choice short-term, long-term doesn't exist because it's long-term. You can't change the world in a few months or a year. So you need to work, often you have to work with partners, you have to work with complementors that you can't control, you have to create ecosystems which take long to create, that involve the development of trust. You have to convince regulators to change certain regulations, etc. All these things take 10, 15, 20 years. And if we look at companies, we often don't think how old they are already. You know, for example, we forget that Amazon is now basically 30 years old. Tesla is 20 years old. So even company, I mean, of course, IKEA is 70 years old or more, but so these companies, even those that are changing the world as we speak, have been there for quite a long time, and they have been following very clearly a strategy that takes years and years and years to shape. Because they're trying to shape the world, they're usually companies with entrepreneurial leaders that want to leave a mark. In a way, they are contrarian. So this has a relationship with the so-called contrarian strategies, a term more used in investment than in management. But so that's another situation where the leadership team of a company or the leader of a company clears the polarities by choosing a strategy, in this case, that makes everybody aware that we're here for the long term, not for the short term. We're not here for the price of the stock, if you're in a publicly quoted company, on the next quarter. But the important thing is that we keep on and on and on and on and on, and until we get there. So that's
Actually,
the
yeah.
now
You're
this is a
making,
problem.
yeah, go ahead.
So I am in a building, and somebody started to work on
Oh,
another
we
floor
can't
of the
hear it.
building.
Lucky for you.
So I hope it doesn't sound. I hope the
No,
quality of the microphone makes it difficult to see. Anyway, sorry about that.
thankfully, the pandemic has gotten all of these various platforms, including StreamYard, to be really good at background noise cancellation, so we can't hear a
Yes,
thing.
very good.
By the way, it so happens that while there is construction in your building, my 2-year-old is screaming her lungs out on the other side of this door, and I'm also happy to report I don't think you can hear that.
No, I have not heard that.
But speaking of being contrarian, actually, we didn't talk about this, but it just prompted. It reminded me of something. I don't know if you've heard about this at all. Back in September, the founder of Airbnb gave this talk where he spoke about something called founder mode. Did that make its way to you at all?
No,
Maybe
but
not.
I think I can imagine what that is. Yes.
Yeah, it was
But
fascinating.
what was he talking about exactly?
So he was kind of saying that as his company grew, and that a lot of founders within, of course, the Silicon Valley context really agreed with him, that he was given a lot of advice about, like, hiring people, like that subsidiarity piece, etc., like just letting people make decisions, stepping away from the operations. And that he, as a CEO, had found that to have had disastrous consequences. And so rather than balancing his polarities, he was saying he went back into what they call founder mode versus manager mode, meaning going back to those slightly radical ways of being, very hands-on leadership. Of course, refocusing heavily on customer centricity, speed and agility, resilience and tenacity, whatever. But the big controversial debate was around, founder mode is now perceived as being cool, but is that really, being very strong on this polarity of, like, be still leading the same way you would have in the early days of a company? Is that really what we should be telling leaders to do? So you're just making me think of that, Silicon Valley moment in the last few months. And now a lot of people say it proudly, like, I'm going back to founder mode. But I'm waiting to see what's going to happen with that one, because it is a form of radical management styles, let's say, that founders now being encouraged to bring back, and I think brings back a very strong reliance on founder, and leads to an organization that may not be able to survive their founder. I don't know. I'm a bit skeptical about this.
Right. So for example, a polarity that could be clearly at stake here is control versus
Exactly.
flexibility, or a centralization versus decentralization, although I prefer to see it in this case as control versus, say, flexibility or autonomy.
Yes, empowerment.
I understand. Yes, control versus empowerment. I think I can understand the point made by the founder, but I have, again, advantages of a lot of years of experience, be it in my time as an executive, but mostly in the last few decades as a curious researcher of management and of companies.
Mm.
What happens a lot is that founders, for example, not just founders, but founders in particular,
Mm-hmm.
have a very implicit way of managing.
Mm.
And what I mean by implicit is that they are usually unable to write down, to articulate what guides their decision making. And if you can't write that, then you can't, for example, give more autonomy or decentralize, because the people that are going to make choices on their own, they're still members of the company. Right? Company. Remember, we once discussed this in a closing session of the conference. Company, of course, means companions, all those that share the bread, that do a journey together and share resources. And for this journey to be together, for people to be able to truly share resources, people have to understand, not just by observing what the leader does and following the leader in that literal sense, but because the leader was able to say or write certain rules, certain principles that will allow others in the organization to make choices, to be empowered to make choices. So I would argue that going back to founder mode is often a display of the inability of founders to be managers. And that should not be the case. I think that, but we have seen cases of founders that choose a successor, the term that is usually the one that they refer to. So I've now chose a successor, and then after a few years, that successor is fired, and they return.
Yes, yes, we've seen that many
And
times.
then they choose another one, they leave, and then they return. And so, and this could be indeed because the company has deviated from the strategy
Mm.
that the founder believes is the right strategy, often contrarian, often shaping the market, not adapting to the market. And other managers that may say come from the outside, from other companies or from great business schools, what they were taught, right? The current paradigm of management is adapt, 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 not shape. That doesn't
Mm.
exist in the current, unless you do courses on entrepreneurship. But you don't think of entrepreneurship when you join a company that is already tens of thousands of people, billions of dollars of sales, has existed for 20 years. You don't usually think of that as a startup.
Mm.
So that's a limitation also of the paradigm. So there's this disconnect between what the founders want and have pursued, but are unable to articulate, and those that join the company not having been with the founder from the beginning, because the company in the meantime has grown, and therefore, and they were trained to do certain things, say in a great business school or in another company that is more an adaptive kind of, we adapt to the market kind of thing. And then there's all this confusion. This was a long statement of mine, but I think it's a very important point, because some of these polarities, like this one, may indeed be a display of the limitations of the individuals, in this case, acting as leaders, which, by
Yeah.
the way, brings us to the next
I was going to say,
chapter.
we did not plan this, but it's a
No,
perfect
no, no,
introduction.
it connects to the next chapter.
Um, yeah, it is absolutely the perfect introduction to our third chapter, which is about confusing the whole and the parts, or the parts and the whole. Because as humans, of course, we need these frameworks, we need simplifications, we need concepts that we are able to understand, right? Because we see ourselves at the center of the world, as we do. Um, and therefore, I think one of the things that I've seen, you asked me what was some of the stuff that I learned throughout the conference, or some observations that I had. And I told you, this polarity thing, it applies so well at the individual, even collective, like team level discussions. Of course, I made a talk earlier today to talk about how it applies at the organizational levels. But I felt that sometimes we confused the polarity at the coaching person level with the organization, and that we're not really able to distinguish between our polarities as humans and individuals and leaders and those of the organization. And I think that founder mode is a beautiful example of this lack of distinction between the part and the whole, the founder and the organization, and brings us beautifully to this third chapter. And the first discussion, actually, that we wanted to have was the human limitation of understanding complexity systems, and therefore we reduce things to polarities sometimes.
Absolutely. So again, as individuals, and therefore as leaders, or as team members, if we're thinking of a small team, as individuals, we are limited. We are limited in our ability to reason. We are limited in our ability to contain data and information that we may use for example, certain choices or certain behaviors, or for explaining choices and behaviors. What we call bounded rationality. So we are rational, but boundedly so. We don't have unlimited rationality. Our ability to compute is limited. It's part of our ability to hold data and information is limited, because we are human beings. We have other amazing qualities, of course. In particular, we have emotions, and we know basically that emotions often drive our decision making or our rationality, or at least the two are tremendously intertwined in what makes us human and not machines. And one of those limitations is that we have trouble understanding the world as a complex system. For those that study the evolution of our species, say, because that was never necessary really for our survival, and therefore we have developed a simple model of the world, which is kind of linear, meaning, small things are small, big things are big, and so be careful of big things because they'll have a big impact, and small things may have a small impact. That's typical linear thinking. And then we reduce the whole to the parts because it's much easier to think of the parts because the parts are like us, parts. Of course, in certain we can come back to that if we have time. In certain fields of knowledge, we don't make that confusion. We separate the whole from the parts. But again, in things that are often related with us or with the obvious behavior of the physical world. But there's something in which the social world, organizations, for example, society, are much more complicated than the physical world, are much more complex. And this is why we often absolutely need a systemic view of the world, which, by the way, is something that was also a thesis of the conference, that you and several of your guests have discussed during this 2 months long conference. So leaders, and surely members of the leadership team, and I would argue any manager, needs to have the ability to see the world, and by the world, that includes the organization itself, the company itself, and of course everything around it, as a system. And not just as a system, but as a complex system. A system that is non-linear, a system, therefore, where small variations can have a huge impact, and big variations may have a very small impact. That's a feature of non-linearity. But also a system that is dynamic, changes over time. And therefore, it's not a system where the parts connect or transact, but rather the systems interact. And again, let's go to a bit of conceptual rigor. When we transact, or when we simply exchange, what we do doesn't really change us. And so if I give you something, then of course, then you have that. You're still you have that. You may do certain things with that will change you, but I'm not necessarily involved in that at all because it will be you and the thing I gave you. But when we interact, what this means is that what I do changes you, and therefore what you are going to do in response to what I did, and what you do in response to what I did changes me. The next time I try to interact with you, I'm not the same me. I was changed by you. And that creates dynamic. And that dynamic is most of the time unpredictable. And the two of us start to create a whole, a small whole. And that whole is, of course, emergent. So there's this notion of emergence, which, by the way, is part of the definition of systemism by philosopher Mario Bunge. And for example, Mario Bunge compared individualism, it's a form of reductionism, with systemism. And again, his critique, that of course I follow completely, is that the current paradigm that we often use, in particular, I would say in management or in business studies, is individualistic, reductionist. Take, for example, this fashion of speaking about talent. And talent are individuals. So it's like if you have great individuals, you'll have a great organization. Completely false. It has never been proven. On the contrary, We have more than the evidence to know that if you have remarkable individuals together, they will usually not create a great organization. But you see, that's a form of reductionism or individualism. Instead of thinking of the company, you reduce the company to the individuals in the company. And you kind of look at the individuals and say, if these individuals are great, then the company is great, which is you reduce the companies to the individuals. So you reduce the level of the whole, the company, to the level of the parts or components or constituents, the individuals. This is the paradigm of management, which is very, very, is grounded on individualism or reductionism of that kind. And what happens then is that certain polarities that don't actually exist at the system level, but exist at the individual level, are taken by the individuals as if they were organizational polarities. And that's the problem. They're not into organizational polarities. They're just polarities for us individuals because we have our nature, and our nature is limited. And an example that I sometimes use is the short term versus long term. And if we continue to understand this short term, long term as individuals, as we tend to do, thinking about time, literally. So short term is like the time nearby, 3 months, a year. Actually, when I was taught strategic planning, again, a decade that will not be named, there was short term, medium term, and long term. Oh, this was more sophisticated. Now the medium term, they kind of evaporated, and it's short term and long term. And short term is anything from usually a quarter to a year or two, but long term is like years ahead. And then people have these amazing expressions such as, oh, strategic means long term. What do you mean strategic? What is that? Where did that come from? But you see, we have these words. Now, is this part of our psychology of time, our fear of the future? I leave that to psychologists or social psychologists to explain. My point is, many decades ago, I already heard that the big problem with planning was short-term, long-term. Now, when I attend any discussion in a company or in a business school, what is the big discussion? Is this short-term and long-term? And I say, guys, we haven't progressed an inch or a centimeter. So perhaps the problem is wrongly formulated, and that's why we can't solve this problem. Now, so what I would argue is that from a company point of view, short-term and long-term have no meaning. Future has meaning, if you wish. But what's relevant is risk versus radical uncertainty, or risk versus absolute uncertainty. And as far as I can tell from many discussions with managers, again, usually in great companies, the advantage of being in a school like INSEAD is that we tend to interact with great companies. And when we research companies, they again tend to be great companies. They may have moments of diminishing performance. That's a different thing. That's actually very important for us to research. Something has to vary. Otherwise, we can't research. We can't understand. Everything is the same. We can't actually learn anything from that. But so I have that privilege of usually interacting with great companies and subjectively competent individuals. And often what really is in their mind, without them saying, when they say short term, is the period where they can figure out the various scenarios or, again, alternative states of the future, and even attribute probabilities to them. That's short term. But when we think of a time that is sufficiently distant, depending on the industry, depending on the circumstances, et cetera, that we're no longer able, that we are ignorant about the future, then people say long term. No, we should say risk and uncertainty. But uncertainty is often confused with high risk, and it's not. So that's why it's better to say absolute uncertainty or radical uncertainty, which is you cannot know the future, you cannot make scenarios about the future, or you have so many possible scenarios that it is the same as having none. And that's that's a true, by the way, polarity. And one, again, where we have to be both. Because if you're managing a company, you have to consider that certain aspects of the future are unknown to you, not just to you, to you and to everybody else. It's important. It's not a matter of subjective ignorance. It's objective ignorance. No one knows. But for other aspects, you can actually have some sense of possible alternatives in the future and so forth. So we should perhaps stop saying short-term, long-term, instead say risk versus radical uncertainty or absolute uncertainty, or if we want to be more technical, for example, economists refer to this uncertainty as Knightian, because an American economist called Frank Knight wrote a book about that in 1921. By the way, the same year where John Maynard Keynes, a very well-known economist, of course, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, wrote a book on probability theory, where he made the same point, which he was going to repeat later in this more well-known work on economics. So this sense that as managers, we have to manage for the future. And that future may be risk or risky, or may be completely unknown. And that's the important polarity. That's the polarity that really, by the way, nobody can clear, because
it wasn't my intention to ask
all the world. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, it wasn't my intention to ask you this question, but I cannot help myself. What would be your advice to leaders with regards? I know you and I talked about this at length in last year's conference, by the way. So for all of those, we talked about Knight, we talked about Keynes. We have a documented written takeaways, and people can also rewatch the episode. But I still, because you say this one cannot be cleared, so I'm going to stop here for a second before we talk about our last paragraph, let's say. How do leaders operate in that context? What is the best advice that you have for them in this one polarity that cannot be cleared?
So my argument, my thesis, is that when you face absolute uncertainty, then it is the board of directors or equivalent that has to make choices that concern that future that is unknown, not management. And board of directors, I'm not just referring to publicly owned companies or quoted companies in the stock market. I'm using board of directors, could be a family that controls a company, or could be even the owner, if there is only one owner or founder of the company. Someone, but not the leadership team, which may be made, for example, of professionals that are there for a few years and then move on or are replaced by others. And because you can't really ask managers, such as I was, to make choices concerning a future that you can't possibly know for a company that you're probably going to leave, like I did. In my case, to return to academia and do what I wanted to do. For other managers, could be for other reasons. They find another company where they are, for some reason, better off, and they move to that one, or for some other reason, they are simply dismissed from the first one. So it is natural that these things, usually there are terms of 3-4 years. Sure, some managers may stay a bit longer, but but kind of it is not quote unquote their responsibility to ensure the future of the company, because that responsibility lies with the board of directors or equivalent entity. They are the ones that have to deal with the long term, i.e., with absolute uncertainty, meaning
Because
the
of
choices, because it is actually their usually by
to live within.
statutory rules, it is their role to do that. In many countries, kind of independently of the form, the legal form of the company, the fact that it is quoted, not quoted, etc., there's usually an entity, let's call it the board of directors, or equivalent, could be the supervisory board in a two-tier system, etc., of governance. But there's always some entity that is the responsible for the management of the company. And then part of that management is either delegated to, for example, managing directors or CEO or team, or in the case of a two-tier governance system, like in Germany, for example, to a board of management.
Sure.
But there is this higher up entity that thinks about the governance of the company and has to make sure the company is sustainable. And
Nice.
that I would argue, or that's my thesis, that it is their role to really clear this for management, or at least clear this in part for management. Otherwise managers do not have the conditions, subjective and objective, to do it, and actually should not do it, exactly because they are temporarily in that position.
I resonate with that a lot from my own personal experience, whether as a manager or as a founder now, and having seen different companies head in directions where I've always had the instinct that was a governance problem. But I think it's really nice that you were able to phrase it and to name it for us. I think that's really, really insightful. Let's talk about our last chapter.
Yes.
And that one obviously comes from what you've dedicated your life's work, at least on an academic level, to studying. That's where our conversation started. And this one I think is the most conceptual of our discussions. This chapter is all about confusing the whole and the parts. We spoke about the human and the organization, but here we're going to talk about reducing the number of levels. And particularly you and I spoke about this a lot in the context of global versus local. But I wonder if you can explain what we mean by levels and why levels matter in the context of emergence. And then let's talk about how managers within global organizations need to think about this distinction.
Yeah, sure. So I will start with an example from, say, the physical world, where this is much clearer. Take even us. You have, with your guests, many conversations about individuals. You had guests that were individuals. We can talk about persons, right? I can talk about me, and you can talk about you, and you can talk about me, and you can compare me with other guests during the conference. And you're doing that at one level, me as a person. Why are you not talking about my cells? Because I'm made of cells. Without cells, I'm nothing. So I have another level, or if we want to be even a bit more complicated, we can say, I am made of organs, which is a level below. Level in terms of system, not power, not hierarchy. It's actually hierarchy, but a systemic hierarchy. So let's say I am made of organs, like my brain, or my stomach, or my heart, or my lungs, or etc. You haven't spoke about them, speak about me. But actually, what I do is in a way, partly dictated by those organs functioning in a particular way. And those organs, by the way, function as they function because they're made of cells. And the cells are connected in some ways, and they're connected with other cells of other organs too. So why is it that people, when they talk about one another, for example, when in companies people do 360 degrees evaluation, they don't talk about the cells of the other or the organs of the other? You see, there we are comfortable speaking about the person, but the person is an emergence, is the result of the integration of the parts that make up the person. Oh, by the way, and this will bring in a very important polarity in philosophy that we're not going to bring in, which is the body versus mind polarity. Because me is not just me, the body, is also me, the mind, or the soul, or the spirit, which, by the way, is now a very interesting topic, again, of discussion in philosophy because of AI. So we are back to discussing, but, is the brain that thinks, or is the conscious that thinks? And what is conscious? So it's the brain plus something else. What else? Anyway, so you see, there are interesting polarities even there, but we're not going there. You see, it's in philosophy, not in physics. But although physicists also like to talk about that. Now, when we come to companies, interestingly, although we can talk of companies as the whole, and we can compare companies as the whole, we then often, when we're trying to improve the performance of the company or prepare the company to be more agile or more robust, then we go to the parts. And we start talking about the parts and what we do with the parts. And the problem is that, again, the current paradigm of business studies, which is about 100 years old, and hasn't really changed, assumes immediately reductionism and assumes the inexistence of radical uncertainty, unless we're talking about entrepreneurship and startups, so to speak. But by the most, it does not. So what happens is that then when we think of the parts making up the whole, we see the whole at the same level of the parts. Let me give you an example that comes from globalization. In the 80s, when globalization started to be more visible, and by the way, politicians made choices that made globalization spread faster than it would probably do anyway. What happened was that people conceived globalization as the aggregation of national markets into worldwide markets that were then called global markets. But you see, markets, local markets, so parts, components, global market, the whole. But what was a global market? It was still a market. So it was a market the size of the world. It was like having a market of a country the size of the world, without borders. By the way, economists, of course, use language quite rigorously. Economics is a discipline, management is not. And a market, when you say that there is one market, you actually mean there is one product and there is one price. So that's one market. Now you can have, of course, segments of the market. And therefore, there could be more than one market that make up the market. But again, in each segment, there's one product and one price, and the products are all of the same type. For example, cars. So globalization in the minds of many managers, in the minds of many investors, in the minds of most people, was understood as a simple integration or aggregation of national markets into a global market. And the aim, which was, by the way, well studied in the early 80s, was to have products that would be the same. Now, they couldn't be the same because local markets have different tastes, different preferences, sometimes different regulations. Certain countries prefer blue and other countries prefer green, and the language changes, and certain features are different. Say, houses are smaller in certain countries, so you can't have huge refrigerators or huge washing machines, but the houses can be big in other countries, so you can have bigger ones. Anyway, small variations. And the idea was that global and local were opposites, were polarity. You either had global, which basically meant the same thing everywhere, and therefore you were acting at the global scale, benefiting from global economies of scale. And by the way, global power, market power, if you could get there. Or local, and local means different in every place, no economies of scale, but very effective. So customers will probably be willing to pay more for a localized version of the product, but then you can't benefit from economies of scale. And there you go then there is efficiency versus effectiveness. Again, the duality between the supply side and the demand side. So for many people, global, local are poles. There's this polarity. And global was essentially conceived as standardization, and local as differentiation across countries, across geography. When actually what happened was that globalization evolved from that very simple concept. And when globalization became globalization, so when the world became global, and the world is global by now, by the way, there's no way back, it actually transformed itself. And the flows of information and ideas became much more relevant than the flows of goods and services, for example. And suddenly we have a world where there is a global world, but the global world is not just the aggregation of markets, it's another level. It's the whole of the world, made of places, made of countries, and if you prefer, made of cities or made of parts of countries, because even countries are different inside. And by the way, strangely enough, one of the completely unexpected impacts of globalization was that the differences across countries became more vivid, and the differences within countries became more visible. So now in a global world, there's, for example, much more difference between, for example, the rich and the poor in many countries than there was before. And by the way, part of that is because of globalization. So what I'm trying to say is that the polarity of global-local doesn't exist, because what we have is a global world, which is at one level, like me, the person, and then there are local places that are the parts that make the world. We, as humans, we are local beings. We do not exist at the global level, like cells don't exist at the level of the person. Cells don't know that I exist, but I exist because there are cells. So there is a global world made of places, and the places integrated in a complex way, dynamic way, complex way, uncertain way, unpredictable way, makes this global world emerge. And as this global world is shaped, there is the global world and there is the local world. The local world is easy for us to understand because we are in it. We are part of it. And so what would I like to end with? Everything around us, everything around me and you is local. Everything is local. Nothing exists down here that is global, because global is the world as a whole. And there's nothing in the world as a whole. In a way, there's nothing in me as a person, only cells. Even my skin is made of cells. Everything is made of cells. But I exist as an emergence. Yeah, that's why, as a system, I exist. And why do I exist? Well, because I have qualities as a person that the cells don't have. And that's what makes me exist, really. Now, we could then discuss whether that's so in terms of ontology or epistemology, but we're not going to go there. We don't have time for that, and it's not actually so important for our point. So our point was some polarities exist because we forget that the whole and the parts are not at the same level. If you reduce the whole to the parts, like thinking of the global market, as a local market the size of the world, is really not a good way to depict the world, is a wrong model for the world. And if you use a wrong model for the world, then of course, as a leader, you're going to make wrong decisions based, for example, on polarities that do not exist. They existed in a simplistic, wrong understanding of the world, but don't actually exist in the world we live in. So I think that was the point that I was trying to make. And this point is also true for multi-business companies. Even if you are in a single country, but you have many different businesses. Again, one thing is the company as a whole, which we tend to call corporation because of the tradition coming from the US, or group, which is another expression used in other countries. So there's the group level, and there are the companies level that make up the group. They're not the same level. They are different levels. Corporate management should only manage the whole, not the parts. So again, here there's no centralization, decentralization confusion unless you put them in the same level. Then there is this confusion. But if you put them separately, it's clear. The leadership of the whole, the leadership of the multinational company should manage the multinational company as a whole. And the leadership of the businesses that exist in the local world, because we only have businesses at the local world, should manage the businesses at the local world. None should be trying to make choices about the other because that's confusion, total confusion. And so the inability to see that our world is made of different levels, and even our companies are made of different levels, calls for systemic understanding of the world, but not just the systemic understanding, an understanding that sees the world as a complex, dynamic system capable of emergence, and therefore where certain levels exist in the sense that we can talk about them, we can manage them without always having to reduce our understanding of them to the level below. And this is, I would argue, not just the final of our arguments about the limitations of polarities. This is probably the hardest one and the most impactful one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually the one we started with. It was your first reaction when I talked to you about this concept. And then we developed all the others. I do want you to end on one last thing that you said to me last time that I thought was absolutely thought-provoking, that I want you to explain it for our audience. As we were discussing this global versus local idea, trying to find companies or leaders that we felt were a good representation of managing globally versus managing locally, you said something where you said, maybe one way to look at this is that the world is a place of exploration and the countries are a place of exploitation. And I wonder if you could just leave us with an explanation of that.
Right. So that's basically what I said a moment ago. Businesses can only exist at the local level. There's no businesses in the world as a whole. But what determines the future of the local level is the world as a whole. By the way, we're still so confused with this confusion of levels that many, even country leaders, speak of us versus them. And they say, our country is so-and-so because their country is doing this and that. So you see, they only see one level and things happen in our level, forgetting that all the countries of the world have somehow integrated in different ways, namely in the last 20 years, integrating amazing flows of information and ideas like never before, billions of interactions that never existed before. and in that interaction plus everything else created this global world. So the parts, my cells, by interacting, make me being what I am. But me being what I am also shapes the cells. So, for example, if I became agitated and nervous and so forth, probably some of my cells, my heart, for example, and the cells in my heart, are going to suffer from that. Suffer in the sense that they suddenly will be asked to do certain things that they may not be ready to do, and they will, quote unquote, suffer for it. Imagine that the cells of the heart would say, you know what, this is the fault of the stomach. Not the fault of the stomach, is the fault of me being agitated. And me being agitated and annoyed, for example, or enraged, is this at my level, not at the level of the cells. You say, Joe, but it's cells perhaps doing certain things that made you, sure. So the parts continuously make the whole what the whole is, and the whole makes the cells be what they are, interaction across levels. It is wrong to say that it is one country that shapes another country. Nowadays, countries shape the world, and the world shapes the countries. The whole shapes the parts as the parts shape the whole. We all understand this if I use, for example, the comparison that I often use when I speak about this, which is, say, a Formula One car. A Formula One car during a race, in a racetrack, under quite extreme performance conditions, like many companies are in extreme performance conditions. If one part, say a tire, or the glue that glues the tire to the rim, or just a small piece of some transmission starts to perform poorly, the whole, the car, the pilot, will start to have difficulties. But if the pilot, for example, if the driver stops the car, then all parts stop, including those that were performing poorly. And therefore, the whole will shape what the parts are doing. Or if the driver decides to even go faster, then all the parts will go faster. So it's not one part that's making the other go faster, it's the whole going faster, including the driver, by the way, because when the car goes faster, the driver also goes faster. And because of that, there may be an accident and the car will be destroyed and probably the driver will be killed. So the interaction that matters to us is the interactions between the parts and the whole, and the interactions between the wholes and the parts, if we confuse the two. Now, the whole world is what will shape the future. And exploration is about the future, not just in adapting to the future, but also in impacting the whole, shaping the whole. But to shape the whole, we need the whole world, or at least many parts of the world, not just one place. And so that's what I say when I mean when I say the world as a whole is the place for exploration. And then we call that global innovation, which is innovating from the world, not from a country, and taking the impact of that in the whole world, which will shape the future of the countries, which will shape the future of exploitation, and therefore the future performance of the company and other companies, competitors, customers, etc. So the world is a place for exploration, and the local is more a place to exploitation, which is why, again, even that exploitation, polarity can be understood differently if we separate the whole from the parts.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
What a beautiful way to wrap this up. We have questions, but we have no time for them, sadly. Joe, this conference would not be what it is without your contribution every year. You simply, Tala said this to you before we entered, and I want to say it again. We end on this conversation, then we spend a whole year learning and relearning from it until we invite you to speak with us again. We're so incredibly grateful for the depth and the amount of knowledge and rigor that you bring to our conversations.
Well, you're very kind. extremely kind, but I also benefit a lot from our interactions with you and other members of Cosmic Centaurs, because they also force me to evolve
Rethink.
and think and articulate things that I may not articulate otherwise. So I
Yeah.
think that this is a interaction that I hope is also useful for those that have seen and
we
listened
are
to
the
us while
party,
we
they are the
interacted,
world.
and others that may see us later on in the recorded version of this video. And it is mostly because I'm often long when I speak. It's part of me, of the features of me as a whole. Don't blame my cells, blame me as a whole. I'm sure that if you have some questions that you will feel we need to answer, either you and your team or me will be delighted to answer that by writing, and you can put that on the Cosmic Centaurs site.
Absolutely.
So it was a pleasure, and I look forward for next year,
year.
because if you invite me and I can attend, it's actually a good sign for me.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to everyone.
My
As we
pleasure.
wrap up the conference with this session, I want to thank you, the Cosmic Centers team, the attendees, anyone who's contributed to this as a speaker, a supplier, a partner, an audience member. From the bottom of our hearts, we're very grateful to each and every single person. All of our sessions, as I mentioned, are available for free to rewatch, to consume, to think through, to rethink now or later. And you can find them on our socials and on our website. Until next time. Et voilà!